I'm actually slipping in to just make a formal announcement that the class of '68 has had its first formal sit-in today already, and that was a group of us looking for a place to eat. And I apologize, but Harry Lewis, who is the commander-in-chief of this building, had said we can eat anywhere. So thanks to Harry, we've had this building and the use of it for the sessions that we have today. And we started the sit-in, feeling very excited about it, filled all the tables, kept talking about how great it felt again to feel like we were younger and sticking it to the man. But it turned out at about 1:10, and I asked there was a person there with a camera, and I asked him if we were in his way, and he said no, but he has to be ready for 2 o'clock. And I said, oh, okay. And at 1:10, he put out some bad name cards here, and all of a sudden I saw that those were classmates' names who are doing the Harvard, the College in Public Policy session. And I thought, my gosh, it took all the vigor out of that, right? You know, we thought we were doing it to someone, but it was us. And so, we're the man. So anyway, thank you, welcome, and I wanted you to know that we've gotten great complaints about the reunion in that there are too many symposia that everyone wants to go to. So you may see people coming in and out. On the other hand, each of these are being taped, and we'll put them on the website soon. And again, as I've asked everyone I see, please not only renew old friendships, make new ones, and dance with everybody you can find. Thank you.
Do I go there?
No.
Okay. No, good. I can see. Hi. Welcome, everyone. Hi. Oops. Here I am knocking things over like a typical '60s person. I think it's great that 45 years later we're all seniors again. That's kind of fascinating. But welcome, everyone. And I'm going to let most folks here introduce themselves to a great extent. You'll figure out what we're talking about. But when Ava first talked to Chrissy and me about the possibility of doing this panel, we spent a long time thinking about the name of it. You know, what is it being? What the '60s in our '60s, and what did that actually mean? How to go about it? And I think there's a lot of folks here on the panel with a number of different approaches to it. I would actually like to start, not so much about, specifically for myself, how I try to keep the '60s alive in my '60s. Although I will say that wardrobe has a lot to do with it. That's always a good start. But I've been thinking about this. I found myself thinking a lot about the context of what brought us first to the '60s and then ultimately to our '60s. And so I wanted to throw out a few ideas along those lines, and we'll have some feedback and stuff, of course. We're devoting a lot of time for Q&A on this, so I'd like to hear from everybody. But one thing that occurred to me was that there were 2 very interesting social developments in America whose birth pretty much coincides with the birth of our generation and of this class. So we're sort of like triplets with these 2 other social developments, which have grown up alongside of us and increasingly in opposition to each other. And I felt that the legacy and the explosion that the '60s meant for at least so many of us, and I expect the folks who particularly chose to go to this symposium, that legacy is sort of incomprehensible without taking a look at the interaction of the other 2 developments that are our co-siblings in being born just after the Second World War. So to talk about the first of one, let me first ask, would anybody in the room who was at 1 year old or more in July of 1947, please raise your hand? 1 year or more. Wow, well, congratulations. You definitely have the seniority among us babies. Nevertheless, I expect that you were not old enough to realize that in July 1947, Congress passed and Harry Truman signed into law the National Security Act. You probably don't remember that. And even if you do, you probably weren't consulted. Nevertheless, it has grown up alongside of us. It was in its total infancy when it began. And in its heels came, for the very first time in history, the American National Security State, with its attendant National Security Council, National Security Advisor, National Security Agency. You can hear there's an echo here already, right? Yes. Certain concerns are apparent. And along with those others that I've mentioned, there was another, not to mention, another three-letter agency that grew up with them, which in fact I won't mention, because it's so widely known, and on the other hand, you never know who's surveilling you, and listening in. So I'll actually just spell it out in pantomime, and hopefully you'll understand that what I'm talking about is. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Only one?
Just kidding. Yeah. Now, so all of that national security stuff, which it was in its infancy when we were in ours, which I think is kind of interesting because, as I said, we didn't get to vote on it, and we've grown up in it as fish in water, to use the old cliche, that it has so surrounded our awareness and grown over a period of time that we weren't really able to notice until it was full grown, kind of like we are. Was the national security state the inevitable aftermath of World War II? This is a question for historians to answer. Oliver Stone has his own theory about that, which if you're familiar, that's kind of interesting. But whether it was inevitable, it was there, as was the military-industrial era that came along with it. I stress that it's hard at this point, there's hardly anybody under the age of 80 that that remembers what America was like before that was so much a part of the country's policy, of our foreign policy, and as we're now especially learning, our domestic policy. So that picture of a pre-paranoid, pre-surveillance America has all but disappeared. And I stress this because I feel that it had a lot to do with what happened in the 60s. As a certain kind of waking up was going on. I also should mention, in its infancy was TV. That our generation were the guinea pigs for the very innovative indoctrinational methods of American television. It started with us. In fact, one of my very earliest childhood memories was the annoyance and the frustration I felt because the Army McCarthy hearings preempted the Howdy Doody show. Who remembers that, right? You couldn't see Howdy Doody because of these very somber people sitting in front of microphones, just like this. But perhaps a little more aggressive in their tone. But in any case, it was like, it's one of the earliest things I could remember happening, and it's an interesting signal of where America was going. Other things that were in their infancy at the same time in that post-war era were the State of Israel, the Cold War, the movement for anti-colonialism, the fear of nuclear weapons. But all of them, I think, in one way or another, are intertwined with that national security state, and which was groping towards its adolescence when we were in the era of Ike and JFK. The other sibling in this trio is a little harder to name in the comprehensive entirety of it, but for purposes of today, I will call it the mainstreaming of psychotherapy. And the reason I think has much greater, I mean, first of all, the psychiatric profession exploded after the Second World War to a degree that it was, not only were there more licensed psychiatrists and other kinds of psychotherapists, but it entered the culture through film, through theater, through literature, in all kinds of ways, in a way that had never been true prior to the war. And I wonder if, to some extent, it might also be an inevitable consequence of the war in the same way that the national security state was, but for different reasons. It was widely known by the time the war was over that 50 million people had been killed by their fellow human beings. And for those folks who had decided that the proper response to that was as much surveillance and buildup of more military power and so on, which was a reasonable, understandable reaction. But there were also people who wanted to ask questions about how did human beings allow such a thing to happen? How did our species get to the point where we could just wipe out 50 million people and take it as a given that that's the way people are? So I think it led to a much wider interest in a deeper exploration of methodically examining human nature and what it is. And that examination really began to change the culture, not just through traditional psychiatry, but all the other methods of all the other kinds of psychotherapy that began to develop. All of the therapeutic professions began to illuminate areas of the mind that were illuminated as never before, including sexuality, and particularly that. I mean, the change of the public discussion of sexuality is unprecedented in any other time. And I think there may be a link to that in general, trying to figure out what is it that makes people tick and why did we do this horribly destructive stuff, and is there an alternative? Because and I'm especially interested in the later developments in the 50s and 60s of what came to be known, however briefly, as humanistic psychology. And looking at models of psychological health rather than psychological illness, that seeing that Freud had really started out by looking at people who were sick. And the pioneer of humanistic psychology, Abraham Maslow, began by saying, let's talk about people who are really well. Let's look at people who are healthy, who do good things and creative things and helpful, kind, creative, uplifting things. And what makes them tick? And why are they the way they are? And why can't they be a model that the rest of humanity could possibly aspire to, especially in the heels of something as disastrous as the Second World War? And it led to, in the much wider culture, a much greater, freer look at the development of a poetic sensibility as opposed to a literal sensibility. It may have been in small corners of progressive, liberal, or even anarchistic and aesthetic human thought, but it began to spread into the whole culture, just looking at that. And you can see why these two siblings of ours on either side would eventually come into conflict, because they represent opposing poles of how to think about, not just how to think about human nature and human beings, but how to resolve human problems. I think one of the great things that Maslow, one of his quotes that I really like, is that repression is not a useful way of solving problems. And as that new emphasis on mental health began to spread into the culture, we began to realize that that violence and the national security state was actually creating a form of repression. It was like, rather than trying to let people's inner deepest self flower, it was pushing it back, because it came more out of fear than it did out of kindness and love and respect. And so that this way of thinking about human nature began to have repercussions certainly, way outside of the healing and psychotherapeutic professions. And at this point, the more progressive voices began to, in social criticism, began to take some of these lessons to heart and began to warn of an artificial plastic quality that was beginning to creep into American life, more and more so in the 50s and the 60s. But in the late 50s and early 60s, nobody paid too much attention to social critics like that, given the alternative of My Three Sons and Gunsmoke, especially when they started broadcasting in color. Which brings me to the 60s. The thing that I think really exploded, the conflict between these two kind of rival forces, rival social movements, came to a head for our generation with the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, where in some quarters at least, and it seemed at the time very widely, there was a realization that America was not what it claimed to be. That the way America actually behaved to other countries and to its own people was not synced up with our stated ideals and traditions and myths. And it was that cognitive dissonance that woke up a lot of people in what came to be called the 60s, and extending well into the 70s, where the counterculture is one aspect of it, but there were many others. And it came from a very deep sense that we're not living up to what we say we are, and how could we? So these two forces, I mean, and ever since that time, ever since that realization began to spread throughout segments of America, at least, we've had what has come to be known as the culture wars, and obviously, I don't have to say too much about them because they're still going on, and we read about them or experience them every day. And I think what really precipitated a lot of that culture war is that not only did the people who were responding to this awakened sense in the 60s to use very simple, to just call it hypocrisy, a really naked word. It's more complicated than that, but we're not what we say we are. We're presenting a false image to the world. What was really important, there had been criticism like that forever, but what the rebels of the 60s proposed was not just criticism, but an alternative. And that was the thing that was really threatening to the forces of the status quo, that it's not just people complaining, but beginning to say, we can create a different kind of culture. There is the possibility that will be more in line with positive, benevolent human values than with defense and protection and aggression. And that was dangerous. Because so it had to be confronted or dismissed as, oh, it's naive idealism, it's, this is like pie in the sky. Woo-woo stuff. And that's how the culture wars really began. And although they're still going on, the thing that I've been thinking about most is that because they've been so politicized, there has, it's very easy to look at these two opposing poles, to think of them in terms of Republicans versus Democrats, or to go back a little, the right versus the left, to go to the French Revolution where that dichotomy first appeared, or conservative versus liberal. My feeling is that all of those labels don't really get to the heart of what we started to learn in the 60s. And what I think is probably more useful, if you want to approach it from a psychological perspective, is to think of it as a struggle that is much older even than the founding of the United States. It goes well back to, at least Jesus and Caiaphas, if not even further back than that. It's the authoritarian temperament versus the imaginative temperament. And I think that's a struggle that will ultimately determine the destiny of the human species. But the good news, in my opinion at least, is that it's not just either or. There's the interesting thing about authoritarian versus imaginative temperaments is that there's a continuum. Even if you're a kind of like really groovy, imaginative person, if you've ever raised a child, you know that a certain amount of authoritarian, don't do that, is necessary. Some kind of control has to be exercised. It's not just one or the other. It just depends on to what extent they're mixed in and how they affect behavior. Now, I like to shorten, instead of always going around thinking with all of those multisyllabic Latin words, I just like to shorten them into should and could. And, like I know that I should take my blood pressure pills every morning. I don't think it makes me an authoritarian personality, but there are just things that it's really smart to do. But the huge changes that begin to affect you if you get caught up in shouldness versus couldness is shoulds want obedience with an emphasis on punishment, whereas coulds want exploration with an emphasis on possibility. And it's not so much a matter of what's right and what's wrong as at any given moment, what is the better method, the better focus to apply to solving problems. So I'm going to end and pass the mic on to Chrissy, but just as a little thought experiment, if you care to try it anytime, is anytime that you find yourself about to use the word should, change it into could. And see what happens, how it affects your day, how it affects your choice. Not that I should do this or it should be this way, but it could be this way. And how does that open up your mind to possibilities? Because I think ultimately the great thing about the 60s was that sense of possibility. And in spite of the attempt to kind of push it back into the closet, if you will, it's still here. There's always the question of, think of possibility first rather than inevitability. Could rather than should. And just watch what happens. And on that note, I pass to Chris.
Thank you. Now, should I take this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello?
You should.
Okay, I should. I could.
You could.
I could.
You could have that one. All right, but you could not.
Thank you, Steve. I'm so happy to be here, and I just walked over from my mother's house. She's 101 years old, just a few blocks away. So we maybe have a few more years left in us, if we're lucky. Actually, I think I'll take this out the way you did. How do you take this out?
There you go.
Okay, that's better. When I first started thinking about how the values of the 60s informed me and the ongoing arc of my life, only the fun came to mind. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But as I considered those times and how they shaped me, the picture that came up was much more nuanced. Alongside the excitement of rushing to the coop for the latest Dylan or Beatles album and then tearing back to Shepherd House to listen to it on the off-campus house stereo, there were many other things afoot, of course. The social unrest, the unbearable shock and pain of the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the ongoing trauma of the war in Vietnam. But on a more personal level, as a woman, as a lesbian, as an artist, and as the daughter of a famous historian, how did Harvard and the values of the 60s prepare me for adult life, prepare me for life at all? As a woman, how did Harvard prepare me for the world? Well, we were the last Radcliffe class to have our own graduation ceremony in the Radcliffe Quad, and the last to receive a diploma from Radcliffe. We were supposed to have been happy, to be thrilled, to merge our identity with Harvard, in the process losing our identity as Cliffies. The issues of income inequality or glass ceilings, even whether the Signet Society would allow women, were all off my radar. No, I don't think Harvard and the Times did much to prepare me for life in the world as a woman. Sisterhood was a yet-to-be-realized concept. However, I do have this to say for our Radcliffe isolation and separation on the Radcliffe Quad. While our walks to class were longer and particularly painful in freezing weather, maybe that separation was a good thing, It kept us apart and together. The friends I made at Radcliffe I value to this day. As a lesbian, I was completely closeted at Radcliffe. I simply had no gaydar. As far as I knew, I did not encounter one single lesbian while I was there. If there were lesbians, I had no idea. In truth, I had many boyfriends, many of whom I'm very close to this day, but I was often in agony with crushes on girls, hating myself for having those feelings. I was shocked recently to read some of my own journals and discover my own homophobic comments. I graduated unknown to myself in many ways, seeking to bury my true nature as something terrible and repugnant and behaving on the surface as if all were well. What was it like being the daughter of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. at Harvard? Because he was well known then as a former Harvard professor and Kennedy aide, many more people knew me because of him than I ever knew. In some ways, this made me feel special. In other ways, strange and alienating. It was a strange and alienating experience. Furthermore, Harvard is knit into my being. All my family had gone there. That means it was 8 cousins, 3 uncles, 3 aunts, 2 brothers, one who's here. I had grandparents who graduated in the class of 1896 from Harvard, 1899 from Radcliffe. Anyway, a lot of Harvard. So all my family had gone there. I took being at Harvard for granted and feel sure I did not take advantage of my Harvard education as many of my classmates did. I spent a lot of time rejecting it, I think, while I was here. I regret that, although I do have some fond memories of Scandinavian literature class and a Seymour Slive class on 17th century Dutch painting. As for being an artist, Harvard in those days was not a terrific place to be a visual artist. I hope it's a better place now. Although one of my best Harvard memories was the life drawing class that Howard Cutler, Chip Chappell, and I started in the basement of Mem Hall. So now here's where the values of the 60s began to play a significant role. I made a list recently of those values: community, activism, experimentation, rebellion, being in the now, and I realized it was those values that really rescued me and helped to make me whole. It took a few years for those values to kick in, take root, and flourish they did when I wound up in Southern California a few years later, living in a tent behind the house of my beloved Radcliffe roommate, Vivi Peter, and began to explore the counterculture of Venice. And that is where it all began to come together for me. In Venice, nobody knew I had gone to Harvard or had ever heard of my father. Venice in the 70s was a wild place, and it was there that I became a feminist and activist, attending my first consciousness-raising groups and helping to organize others, became a community artist and organizer working for the city of LA, painting murals with gang kids and as well as with inmates in prisons, and founding Spark, the Social Public Art Resource Center. It was also in Venice that I found a safe, nurturing, if somewhat wild environment to come out as a lesbian and began to heal my divided self. This sense of community and activism has continued to guide me throughout my entire life as I became a guerrilla girl in New York, combating sexism and racism in the art world, taught as an artist in the New York City public schools, and in the form of personal activism, adopting my beautiful daughter, Chan, from China. Another 60s memory, California memory. I'm at a party in Ocean Park given by a lesbian couple, Catherine Brem and Cherie Matisse. Cherie has just given birth to twin girls, Zanetha and Nicole, and we are celebrating their arrival. Fragrant scent of marijuana, laughter, goodwill permeate the air. Someone hands me "Be Here Now," and I slump into a happy corner and my mind is blown. What was it about that book which was so mind-blowing? The seemingly hand-stamped text and graphics printed on rough brown paper, its odd square shape that, I wish I actually had brought it along, its odd square shape that you had to turn vertically to read. In preparation for this panel, I recently took a good look at the book. While it was not the awe-inspiring event that I remember from my youth, it still managed to have its moments. Some quotes from it are, any trip, remember trips? Any trip you want to take leads you to the same place. When there is a task, you are the task. Something of help to us now. You've got to go at the rate you can go. When you know how to listen, everybody is the guru. as soon as you give it up, you can have it all. And and then I've now grown from Be Here Now to The Power of Now, which is really a wonderful book. And I'll end with something from The Power of Now, which is allow the present moment to be, and accept it as if you had chosen it. Thank you.
Dale?
Yes. I'm Dale Geringer, and I am the director of California NORML, which is the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws, and I've been very active in marijuana and drug reform issues. And if I could actually move over here so I could speak more directly to the audience. But you know, marijuana was not even a political issue when we were at Harvard. But we were at Harvard at a very magical, important moment when marijuana was more or less discovered by the culture. There's not a whole lot that you're going to find public about any of this stuff. It all happened behind closed doors, often closed doors with towels underneath the doors, and it was certainly not a subject that one heard a lot about. It was not what our parents sent us to Harvard and Radcliffe to learn about. Nevertheless, it happened. And I think I should ask at this point, let's have a show of hands. Who will admit that they have tried marijuana at some point in their lives? Show of hands. Okay.
But we
Now,
did inhale. We did
how? Yeah, but the story on that is he ate a brownie instead. Okay, so how many of you had tried marijuana before you came to Harvard? Something big happened while we were there. So I decided to try to document this by going through the archives of the Harvard Crimson. Actually, before we get to marijuana, there was a drug issue at Harvard just before we arrived. There were the infamous episode of Dr. Timothy Leary and Mr. Alpert, Richard Alpert, the author of Be Here Now, in fact, who had been doing these rather cutting-edge experiments with LSD and psychedelic drugs. And I remember thinking at the time, I was in high school still, that this sounded like interesting cutting-edge stuff. So I was actually rather disappointed when they were summarily dismissed for reasons that I later understood were sort of inevitable in the nature of bureaucracies and government and everything else. But if anybody's interested in this, by the way, there's a great book about the whole, by a guy named Dan Lattin, the Harvard Psychedelic Club, tells the whole story. And the lid was blown off of Alpert and Leary, who were involved in some rather abusive practices, I guess, by strict academic standards, by a Harvard Crimson editor, Andy Weil, Dr. Andrew Weil, whom I think a lot have heard about, and who graduated actually in '64. So he had just left by the time we arrived, although he was lurking in the background, and he'll come up again. Looking through the archives, however, the first mention of marijuana happened actually in December 1964, right after we had entered Harvard. Now, I had forgotten all about this incident, but there's a story about Narcs Jail 3 for marijuana in Cambridge raids. These were townies, but of course there were some implications that something might be a little bit else going on here. And in fact, shortly after, the New York Times ran an article, Marijuana Users Disturb Harvard. University is silent. This stirred Dean Monroe. Remember Dean Monroe to write a reply objecting to and refuting the Times claim that 20% of students at Harvard use marijuana at some time during the university. Now, this is still in 1965. How many here actually smoked marijuana in their first year, in 1964-65 at Harvard for the first? One, two. It happened after that, didn't it? Yeah. In fact, I can date it for myself. It happened on Thanksgiving 1966. In a dormitory in Columbia listening to Magic Mountain by Mussorgsky. Anyhow, and as we know, there was, of course, the great Summer of Love in 1967, the explosion of psychedelic music and psychedelic culture and everything else. And it became too big to ignore. And we find the first report on this in March 1967 by James K. Glassman. Everybody okay? Another Harvard Crimson editor. He was a year after us. And I guess he moved on to do a lot of things. He's director of the George W. Bush Presidential Library Project now. It's interesting, the twists and turns that fate's set out for us. But anyhow, James K. Glassman wrote about an enormous increase in the use of drugs in the yard. 25 to 30% of all students have tried marijuana. Now, we're admitting it, but it's a couple years later, it's 1967. Well, Dana Farnsworth, director of Student Health Services, remember him? He had to chime in on this, found this was very distressing. Marijuana was a dangerous and harmful drug, and he really couldn't say anything very good about it. There was an editorial or actually a letter to the Crimson by a junior fellow who I named Bruce Jackson, who challenged Dean Monroe's statement and the myths repeated by Dr. Farnsworth. And there was also a very interesting editorial by Judge Charles Wyzanski of the class of 27, who titled Alternative to the Draconian Drug Laws, in which he took, I think, a very wise and sort of moderate position on this thing. But he said that, there were possible problems with this, but again, the dangers of marijuana might have been exaggerated, and liberty is too often sacrificed for supposed advantage of health, is what the learned judge said. He was a U.S. district judge. Well, anyhow, that is pretty much what the Harvard Crimson has to report about marijuana while we were there. What actually happened, of course, happened in hundreds of different dorm rooms and on and off campus, and I think we all have our stories about this. So I should tell my marijuana story. Maybe we can hear some more from the audience later. My story was fittingly on the last day of exams in senior year. I had just acquired the largest amount of marijuana I think I'd ever acquired, like maybe 2 or 3 ounces, fairly decent looking stuff, and I thought this would be a great time to celebrate end of exams. I went back to my apartment to do so. Now, at that time, I was living off campus in Somerville in a duplex on the 2nd floor. I had a roommate who was there who had recently been joined by his girlfriend who had eloped just before her graduation ceremony at Vanderbilt Law School to come join him, much to her mother's ire. So they were doing their thing in their room behind locked doors, and I went behind my door to smoke some pot. And no sooner did I started smoking a couple puffs, but I heard a very loud and insistent doorbell, repeated doorbell and thumping on the door. I said, well, my roommate's not going to get out of bed right now. I better go down and answer it. So I run downstairs. After throwing my clothes back on, I was changing clothes too in the middle of all this. And of course, I throw up the windows of my room to let the smoke out and close the door to my room. Running downstairs, here are two men in trench coats. And one of them flashes a badge and says, Sergeant O'Reilly, Somerville Vice Squad. And he points to the name on the door of my roommate and says, are you this fellow? I said, no, that's not me. Well, we've come to arrest him for cohabitation. All right, well, his girlfriend's mother had complained, was the story. Okay, my heart had dropped to the bottom of my feet. I ran upstairs as fast as I could, of course, the cops following me behind, and blockaded the door to my room while trying to get my roommate and his girlfriend out to face the music. And while I was standing there barricading my room, trying to make small talk with the cops, they apologized and say, you know, we really don't like to do this kind of thing. We wouldn't have done it except, you know, the girl's mother complained. I mean, we were just doing, we'd like to do more important things. We just did a hashish raid. Well, I managed to survive this episode. My roommate and his girlfriend were taken into custody briefly and then faced their mother, I think, and all worked out there. But I was scared to witless. And so I knew that they were going to come back with a search warrant and get my pot. So I threw the pot that I had in the room out the window from the second floor down into the yard below. That night, it rained very, very hard. The next morning, I started having second thoughts about this. Well, if they were going to arrest me, they would have arrested me then. They haven't come back, and that was some good pot that I threw out the window, wasn't it? And I went out and managed to recover maybe a tenth of what I had thrown down there that had survived the rains and not washed away, and the sun had come out and dried out. And I tried it, and frankly, it was, I'd say, the best pot I ever smoked in my life. So some good came out of that anyhow. Anyhow, that was my episode at Harvard, and I'm glad to say most of us got through pretty much unscathed by the law while we were there, although there were some people who had some episodes afterwards. And let me say that, recount now what happened afterwards as marijuana started to become a big political issue because Harvard was at the center of that. And the first step actually occurred right after we graduated in December 1968. There is a story in the Harvard Crimson about a new study that had been done by Andy Weil, who had been working at the School of Medicine with Professor Norman Zinberg, just putting subjects under, observing subjects who smoked marijuana. And what he found was really shockingly little seemed to happen. Their pulse sped up a little bit, and they had red eyes. They did not have dilated eyes, as had been the widespread myth of police forces. And they seemed to be, if anything, more competent than regular people at driving, strangely enough. But this sort of undercut a lot of the mythology that was out there. And it was soon picked up in more sweeping and systematic fashion by Professor Lester Grinspoon, my good friend at the Harvard, who I did not know then at all, at the Harvard Medical School, who started out trying to research this marijuana stuff, convinced that it was really dangerous thing. It was new on campus, and he was going to find out what was going on here. And the more he looked at it, the less he saw showing that it was actually dangerous. And then he realized that the whole thing looked like a fairy tale. And he wrote a book called Marijuana Reconsidered, a very comprehensive look at what marijuana was scientifically, what it did and what it did not do, and pretty much debunking the whole reefer madness mythology that had been around. Well, that book became very important and influential. Dr. Grinspoon went on to testify before Congress. We testified before the Presidential Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, which again was after we had left Harvard, and that was in 1972. NORML, National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws, was founded again in the early 70s, again after we were out of Harvard. But Dr. Grinspoon has to be mentioned with Andy Weil, Professor Zinberg, as a pioneer of the marijuana legalization movement. Now, I should say there's some other Harvard graduates who've been very important in this, who some of you may have heard of. Anyhow, Ethan Nadelman, class of '79, is the founder of the Drug Policy Foundation, Drug Policy Alliance, which is having its meeting in Denver right now that I have to go to as soon as this is over. But probably the most articulate and influential critic of the drug war in general. He was in the same class as Robert Raich. You may have heard of the Raich Supreme Court decision, where the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government can forbid a woman from growing marijuana even to save her own life if no other drugs are available under its powers of interstate commerce. She has no right to do that. The case involved Robert Raich's wife at the time, Angel Raich. He was the original attorney on that case. I should also mention my good friend Fred Gardner, class of '63, who knew Andy Weil and now edits O'Shaughnessy's, which is a journal on medical cannabis, probably the best newspaper news service specifically on medical issues of cannabis. And my friend David Bronner, class of '95, Dr. Bronner's Soaps and Medicines, who has been very interested in hemp products. If you're looking for hemp soap, I would certainly recommend Dr. Bronner's. As for myself, the way I got involved in this was very incidentally and much later in the 80s. I went to grad school, studied public policy at Stanford, and did a PhD dissertation on FDA drug regulation. It was called Consumer Choice and FDA Drug Regulation. And it had to do with pharmaceutical drugs. It didn't have anything to do with psychoactive drugs. But it was the same general field. My general thesis was that the government should do more to help people make intelligent decisions about drugs rather than try to take over those decisions itself and protect them excessively from often beneficial experimental new therapies that may be available. Well, the war on drugs was really ramping up in the late 80s. And I saw an opportunity that NORML was falling apart. There was no drug reform movement, but I was getting really incensed because I was living in California at the time. They had helicopters coming in, trying to chase down the pot plants in the up north in the redwood country, which I loved so well. They were militarizing the backcountry basically, and they were taking people's property, and of course people were going to prison left and right. I was pretty outraged. I got involved in this marijuana thing back there. Nobody at all supported drug legalization of any sort in the late 80s. So I thought this is a good time to get involved in the movement, while it's at the bottom. It can only get better from here. I was wrong. It actually got worse from 87 to 1991. And then in 91, it turned around. I became involved with a friend, Dennis Perrone, in San Francisco politics, who was an organizer in the gay community and also had a lot of friends in the HIV/AIDS community, where marijuana was starting to come into medical use. And he ran a ballot initiative in San Francisco in favor of medical marijuana that won 80% of the vote, much to our mutual astonishment. So that became the California's Compassionate Use Act, the Prop 215 in 1996, which I helped write and organize. Now, I had never intended to get involved in the medical issue. I was involved in this because I saw it as an issue of personal freedom and personal autonomy. And I was really interested in the freedom to explore alternative modes of consciousness. But after getting involved with NORML, I was getting lots and lots of phone calls from people who had very serious medical conditions of untreatable chronic diseases, often very rare ones, immune diseases, diseases involving chronic pain and spasticity and nausea and things like this. All sorts of different diseases. And they were calling and saying, wow, hey, marijuana seems to be the only thing that can help me. What can I do about it? And I said, gee, we can't do anything now. The government says it's totally illegal to Schedule I controlled substance. We ought to do something about it. And do something we eventually did, and that was Proposition 215. But when we passed the medical marijuana initiative in California, I still thought we were helping just a tiny minority, like 1% of the pot smokers were medical marijuana users. Well, lo and behold, in the year or two that followed, increasingly, friends of mine who had been longtime pot smokers suddenly declared themselves to be medical. In fact, within a couple years, like the majority of my peer group, who were then about 50 years old, were medical users. And I felt very conflicted about this. I felt I needed actually to get some medical credentials in order to monitor what was going on with all of the medical cannabis clubs that were starting to spring up, which always had very strict policies about screening to allow only patients come in. I didn't really regard myself as a patient. However, age makes a difference here, and in my mid-50s or so, I started to develop some blood pressure issues. And lo and behold, that turned out to be a very good reason to use marijuana. Low-level dosages every day really are helpful in dealing with stress and relaxing oneself and cutting the blood pressure. I didn't discover it, a lot of other people discovered it as well. So I had my medical excuse. This year I got another one too. I actually had a partial colonectomy earlier this year. They detected a small cancerous growth in my colon. Fortunately, they cut it out and everything looks fine. However, there is a literature out there about cannabis actually being useful for suppressing colon cancer, in particular a number of other cancers as well, glioma and whatnot. So I thought, what the heck, I might as well at least take a daily dose for that purpose too. Now for you seniors in the audience, by the way, there have been a lot of scientific developments in cannabis that have changed it rather completely. One thing is the rediscovery of a component of cannabis that sort of got lost by the wayside. It was called CBD, or cannabidiol. Most of the marijuana that people smoke, they smoke it to get high, and the chemical that makes you high is called THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. And most of the marijuana has very high proportions of tetrahydrocannabinol in it. However, inactive plants that are bad to smoke, ditchweed, if you've ever smoked ditchweed from old hemp that used to grow in the Midwest, that has high levels of CBD. Doesn't make you high, but it turns out to have a bunch of medical properties of its own, and combined with THC, it cuts down on the anxiety, on the loss of focus, loss of short-term memory, and makes it a lot easier to deal with the THC at the same time. It gives you the medical effects without getting you too high and confused. Great thing for the senior set, and so we're trying to promote that at this very moment. Let me ask, how many in this audience still occasionally use marijuana for medical or other purposes? Aha. Have any of you read my book on Marijuana Medical Handbook, by the way? Anyhow, talk to me about it afterwards. In the end, we're pursuing this issue now. It's actually reaching its climax. Quite unexpectedly, in the last 3 or 4 years, since the Obama administration, public support for the whole concept of legalizing cannabis in general and not for medical purposes has suddenly taken off. And maybe you saw the article in just the other day, a Gallup poll now reports 58% support for legalization of marijuana in the general population. We have majorities even reporting it in Texas. I'm at work in California. We're going to have a legalization initiative out there probably in 2016, and we are going to carry this thing home. But to me, it's become a cutting edge issue because it's an issue of personal freedom, personal bodily freedom, personal freedom of consciousness. Can we have the freedom to explore alternative modes of consciousness, or are we instead constrained by law and authority to only the government-approved drugs, which are now alcohol and tobacco? It's an issue, I think, with cutting-edge implications as the 21st century proceeds. I think we're going to find a whole lot of new and amazing ways of exploring alternative consciousness and alternative medical treatment. It's important that these options not be lost along the way. And also it's important that we end this drug police state that we've built up, where we now have 500,000 people in prison in the United States for drug offenses that were not even a crime in my grandparents' generation. My grandparents were born in the 1880s. You could walk into any drugstore in the United States. You could buy heroin, you could buy cocaine, you could buy morphine. Over the counter, you would sign a little poison register, and that was it. And the problems they had with drugs were actually a lot lower than our problems today. You know, we, I think, in the class of the 60s, witnessed the death of Victorian sexual morality. I mean, Victorians had this view that there only certain kinds of sex were permissible and everything else has got to be, you know, criminal. And you know, I think while we were at Harvard and in the years thereafter, that sort of ended, and sexual freedom is taken for granted now, but our freedom to use drugs is much, much lower than our Victorian ancestors knew how to deal with this a lot better than we do. So I think it's a new frontier for changes of consciousness in the 21st century. Thank you.
Okay. Wow. Does anybody need to stand up?
You could
No, it's okay. Wow. This is quite an eclectic group. I can't wait to hear what you all have to say, but I'm afraid you have to wait a little bit longer. 2 more of us to go. Thank you. Many of us, I think, including me, are still marked by the dreams and the nightmares of the 60s. I'm reliving this now because I'm writing a memoir, and I'm going to share a very short excerpt with you. And I have to say, this is a Cliff Notes version, Cliffy's. I still haven't decided if I'm going to publish this, and it is the first time I'm telling this story in public. For me, the 60s also includes the early 1970s, so I hope you'll indulge me in that. And at the very end, I'll give you just a tiny few sentences on how it works for me now in 2013. But take us back to the early spring of 1975. In order to persuade the city editor of the Los Angeles Times to hire me, I had talked about my access to radical leftist sources, hoping it would make me seem useful in covering the counterculture and anti-war movements. After I'd been only at the paper for a couple of months, Mark Murphy called my bluff. He motioned me into his office. "Go find Patty Hearst," he said. She'd been missing for a year. I was supposed to succeed where the FBI and every living private detective on earth had failed. When you're stuck in a corner, there's only one thing to do: redefine the problem. "She's not the real story," I said. My colleague Narda Zacchino and I decided to figure out where the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA who had snatched her, fit into the radical movements of the 1960s. Now, is there anyone here who's from the SLA? Good. Okay. Then you won't know whether I'm telling the truth or not. Okay. I was, at 28, maybe some of you were too, susceptible to the romance of revolution. Part of me sympathized with Patty Hearst's kidnappers. I understood the draw of living life intensely with great meaning. I, too, wanted to save the world from injustice and poverty, didn't many of us? The SLA were young, white, middle-class college kids mostly, and they had met in the Public Service Prison Project at Berkeley, which could also have happened to me at Harvard in the 60s. Our generation, as we all know, was caught up in the anguish of America's poor black underclass, the dream of a better world, blah, blah, blah. We know that. And I was personally fascinated by people, including fanatics, who thought they could make this happen. But it was clear from the start that these SLA guys were nuts. They weren't marching for civil rights down south. They weren't even making terrorist bombs like the Weather Underground. They were picking up guns to start a violent revolution in America's black and brown ghettos. They had no idea what they were doing. A black prisoner they'd met had told them he had a plan, and they had believed that. So we all remember that Richard Nixon, the archenemy of the left, had to resign in shame after the Watergate scandal. The Vietnam War was over. Washington was full of zeal for reform. Congressional committees were starting to uncover terrible things the FBI and CIA had been doing. Had the radicals won? Where did Patty Hearst fit into all this stuff? The epicenter of this seemed to be California's Bay Area. So we embarked on the project, and as I was rooting around San Francisco for information about Patty Hearst and the SLA, Carol Pogash of the San Francisco Examiner generously shared a source with me. Sally Moore, a middle-aged housewife who had actually become friendly with some of the clandestine radical groups, like the Revolutionary Union, and was willing to talk about them, and she was eager to talk to anybody. And she'd come from a house in Danville, California. Anybody here from Danville, California? It's a suburb 30 miles from San Francisco, and she was participating in the $2 million public food giveaway William Randolph Hearst had launched to fulfill the SLA's first ransom demand. There, Sally had met some activists who seemed committed to helping the poor and addressing racial injustice, so she had started attending some political meetings. Then the FBI, speaking of your NSA, the FBI asked her to report to them about these people. Sally was eager to be popular and famous. She was flattered and became their spy. Now she was talking to me, a reporter. I decided that she herself should become a big character in our series because it was a great sidebar about a frowsy housewife who'd gotten caught up in the Hearst kidnapping, the radical scene, and the FBI craziness that was San Francisco in 1975. She had her own reasons for talking to me. Sally wanted my Los Angeles Times story about her to be her coming out notice to the FBI because she decided to break with them and join the romantic radical cause. She said she wanted to be a genuine part of the revolution, to fight against the FBI and the capitalist state it protected. So I drafted my profile of Sally, put it aside, and Narda and I worked on the main pieces we were doing about the anti-capitalist focus of the 1960s radical movement. You're going to confirm that or not for me, Michael. The scope of the FBI's COINTELPRO dirty tricks, the Black Panthers, and other themes. Nothing we were writing was quite ready yet, when on September 18, Patty Hearst and the Harrises were unexpectedly, to us, captured by the police. Suddenly, we had to throw what we had into the paper, whether it was finished or not. Narda and I worked feverishly all weekend to get the series ready to start in the Monday paper. All the rest of our stories and sidebars were supposed to run over the next 4 days. I finally crawled into bed in Malibu as the sun was coming up on Monday morning. At 9 a.m., the phone rang. It was the LA Times switchboard. Somebody named Sally Moore was trying to reach me from San Francisco. Should they put the call through? Before cell phones, you remember that? No, I said. Tell her I'll call her back in a couple of hours. And I got up reluctantly from bed. When I finally staggered into the office at noon, All the top editors of the newspaper were huddled at my desk waiting for me. They were agitated. Someone handed me a piece of wire copy with a photo. "Is this your source, Sally?" Yes, it was. The news bulletin said that moments before, she had tried to assassinate President Ford. Luckily, her gunshot had been deflected. She had been wrestled to the ground and was now under arrest. Sally was Sarah Jane Moore. I was in shock, of course. What if I had taken her call? Before I had time to think, my phone rang. It was Sally's public defender lawyer calling me from San Francisco. He said Sally wouldn't cooperate with her own defense until she talked to me. This is like at a front page, right? This is true. I'm telling you a true story. I was able to catch the last plane that night to San Francisco. In the jail, through a thick plastic barrier, I faced Sally, who was at that moment the most notorious person in America and parts of the rest of the world. She was wearing a nightgown and a red sweater. "Why did you do this?" I asked. "Because the FBI had to. They killed your story about me," she said. "What?" I gasped. "The FBI killed it. It wasn't in the paper this morning." "But Sally," I said, "nobody killed your story. Today's Monday. Your story was set to run on Wednesday." "Oh," she said. This is a true story, people. My worst nightmare had come true. I could have prevented the whole thing if I had taken her phone call that morning. The power of the press isn't what it used to be now, what it was back then, to inspire, deter, or in my case, unwittingly change history. So that was then. What about now? Well, she's out of jail, but I'm going to switch the subject. I'm not chasing radicals. I'm not a radical either. Crowdsourcing through Twitter, Facebook, blogs has replaced our unholy power as journalists to convene and influence. And so what we don't write gets published by people anyway. So instead, I'm doing what I actually wanted to do all along. I'm an activist. Driven by those old dreams of saving the world, I have a project in Budapest, where I live, trying to help the most downtrodden people in Hungary and Europe, the Roma, the Gypsies. For at least 400 years, they've lived in settled neighborhoods in Hungary, and 80% of them speak Hungarian. But they're not seen as Hungarians. They are despised and mistreated. I have a Roma tolerance and respect project that includes workshops and a website, which we're launching next week. If you have questions about the story about Roma couples stealing white babies, please see me afterwards. It is possible in the current Greek case, and they didn't seem like the most upstanding folks in what I was seeing. But beware, this is an old stereotype created by racists and often has little foundation in the facts. And I'm always interested in the facts. That's my curse as a journalist. Last Saturday in Budapest, I found myself marching in the first ever Roma Rights Pride Parade. I was one of the few white faces and the only American in sight. Suddenly, in front of me, I heard a mixed group of 3 people singing in English, and I had a picture that didn't arrive in time. I was going to show you these 3 incredible people. And what were they singing? They were singing, "We Shall Overcome." I ran up and sang it with them. So yes, I'm living the 60s in my 60s, and I hope you are too.
Well, this is a sort of throwback, this panel, this experience of surprise and information and different perspectives. Ellen wanted me to reflect a little bit on politics, SDS, the anti-war movement. I want to be brief. Hopefully we can get some dialogue going and some conversation. First, a quick sociological exploration. How many of you were actually members of SDS, even in just one way or another? Just a few. Reasonable group. Just to continue my curiosity, how many of you have children in one way or another? Adopted, biological? And how many of you have grandchildren in one way or another? All right. You know, I started to think about this. I don't often spend a lot of time thinking about Harvard and coming to Harvard. First shock was for me to realize that we all arrived at Harvard 49 years ago. 49 years ago. That's hard to even comprehend. Yeah. Different time, different world. No co-ed dorms, right? No salad bars. Parietals, you remember those?
Yeah.
Open door, 1 foot on the floor. How did that go? 3 feet on the floor. 3 feet on the floor. And it was illegal in a majority of states for men and women of different races to marry. Think about that for a minute. It was illegal in a majority of states for men and women, grown adults of different races, to marry. It was illegal in almost every state for two consenting adults of the same sex to make love. It was a different world. 3 civil rights workers had just been killed in Mississippi. June 12th of the summer before we came here, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. August 10th, just before we came here, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed overwhelmingly. And within 12 months, there would be 200,000 troops in that war. So much has changed. So much should have changed. So much still needs to be changed. You know, when I came to Harvard, I was concerned overwhelmingly with one question. And for those of you who are in SDS, you may have met me in a dorm or come to a meeting, and I probably asked the question: how to live a meaningful life, how to live a life that mattered, how to have a moral life in the face of the American experience, the American wonderful richness. I must admit, all these years later, I still ask myself that question. Then I was younger and I was arrogant, and I thought I had the presumption to change lives and lead people. On a personal note, I'll tell you that while I still believe passionately in change, I no longer have that arrogance and believe that I can or should lead people. But that doesn't mean there isn't work that ought to be done. When I think back to the 1960s, when I think back to SDS, to the anti-war movement, to the civil rights movement, to the birth of the women's liberation movement, I think back with a mixture of pride and regret. The regrets, by the way, are not for what we were fighting for. It was that we were so young. I don't just mean young chronologically. We had no one to help us. You know, when I first came to Harvard, I'd pass out literature, many of you probably received it, in which I would say, quoting from I.F. Stone and State Department, the President of the United States is lying about the war in Indochina. And you know what the overwhelming response was? You may have a point about Vietnam, wherever that is, but the President of the United States would never lie. You know, different times, different times. But we couldn't even find professors to teach us about the history of Indochina. We had to find it and learn it ourselves. We were so young. And we went from trying to give birth to a new left, a left that was rooted in American democracy, that spoke in an American idiom, that really rejected the orthodox left with state control to instead try and build a new experiment in democracy. And one of the things that I hate the most about the war in Vietnam, I mean, I hate it because it was unnecessary. I hate it because 50,000 Americans lost their lives. I hate it because 2 million Vietnamese lost their lives. But I also hate it because it ended our attempt to build a new left, ironically. Because as we got bigger and bigger, as we got more and more into leading an anti-war movement that was necessary and needed to be created, the pressure on us got more and more and more. And when I look back to 1968 and 69, what I see are friend after friend after friend going crazy. Just going crazy. Not because they had to, but because the pressure was so much. Often, you know, I meet younger people who knew that I spent 30 years as an organizer, and they say, so do you miss the 1960s? No. You know, for many of us, I'll speak only for myself, I woke up every day thinking people are going to die today unless I do something. That's a terrible way to be at 18, 19, 20, and 21. It's a terrible burden to have to carry, particularly because you didn't know really what to do. I mean, we made it up. Every day we made it up. And tragically, this effort to create an American left ended up, frankly, in craziness. The craziness of the Weathermen, the craziness of the Progressive Labor Party, the craziness of so many different things. And I think the cost to the country has been huge. I think the absence of a serious left to engage in debate and discussion about what kind of society we need to have, that absence has affected all of our lives over these last 40 years. And you know, to me, others hold a huge responsibility for that. In 1968, when the rest of the country came against the war, turned against the war, the majority opinion turned against the war. Instead of being able to lead that, we felt we had to go further left, be more extreme, right? When we should have been exactly the opposite. We should have embraced the fact that the rest of the country now had come to our position. But we were young. When you're young, you have no mortgages, you have no kids, you have a wonderful opportunity to study and to think. And so young people become so often the forces for change. Now, we're not young. We're old. I don't know about you, but when I was at Harvard, I thought about the death of other people, but I never thought about my own death. I was immortal. Now I know that's not the case. But we have children. We have grandchildren. We have the grandchildren of friends. And the question remains, what kind of world are we going to leave to them? And increasingly, I wish I could say I was in this category, we won't have mortgages. We won't have work to go to every day. We're going to be retired. So what is it going to mean to continue the spirit of the 60s in our 60s and 70s? I hope it means taking all our lifetime of experience, all of our failures, all of our hopes, and finding a way once again, in whatever way is appropriate, wherever we are, to reach out and to play a role in politics and in our communities so that the problems we know, I could do a long list, we know them, right? It's not like inequality has gotten less, it's gotten more. It's not like government has restrained the wealthy elites for the common good. It's gotten worse. It's not as if climate change is a hoax. It's not. It's not as if race no longer matters. It still does. It's not as if equality has been achieved for everybody and we have embraced diversity in its fullest sense. We know there is work to be done. I can't tell you how to do it. I can't tell you where to do it. I wouldn't presume to. But I will tell you that as we get old, the burden on us is just as great to find a moral life, a life of meaning, which will be judged by what we leave to our children and our grandchildren. Thank you. So hopefully we can hear from people.
Yeah.
Questions, comments?
Can I ask you to use these microphones for the recording and also for hearing?
Stunned silence?
I always could put an audience to sleep, but I thought.
My feeling is that people of our age and our class lived through a unique historic moment, that not only did we have the 60s, we were the generation born right after World War II. We went through an era of economic prosperity that may have been the biggest in the history of the world. And things did happen. Everybody touched on this. One of the things that I muse about sometimes is the term that was used a lot was anti-establishment. You never hear that anymore. But there was this huge tectonic shift that combined Kennedy's assassination, a breakthrough in music. Rock and roll was a function of the transistor radio, where people had their own radio and didn't have to listen to their parents' music. And the experience of the Vietnam War was as much as justified, and I was against the war before I came to Harvard. I had done an assignment in high school, a research project on Vietnam, and suddenly the monks were burning themselves, and in fact it's going to be the 50th anniversary of the Diem coup, and as you mentioned, the Tonkin Gulf thing happened just before, but part of the reason, and it was unique, that a college youthful generation could influence policy or oppose it was not just idealistic but selfish, because all of us, the men at least, had to face the possibility that we would have to go to war, that we had a self-interest. And as much, I totally feel that it was a horrible war and it was justified, there was something that happened which hasn't happened since then, because we fought worse wars in Iraq, but college students don't feel that they may have to go. We also underwent the technology revolution, and at the end here, as after this prosperous era, we are seeing one of the biggest economic catastrophes, and somehow are we handing this on, the environment, you know, after the great achievements of our generation, suddenly all these things are not under our control. But I feel this whole span, this period, and including sex being also there was not only the atomic bomb, but the population bomb. That was the big thing in the 50s, and birth control. And somehow these things all came together. And that's why people are still fighting about the 60s. But I do think there is this amazing uniqueness to this historic period that is now leaving, that we are retiring at the same time this history that we've gone through is not something that is going to follow a straight line. Suddenly, China is doing to us what we did 100 years ago. We were the manufacturing floor of the world. Technology is so disruptive that companies that were the king of the hill disappear in 2 years. And if you look forward, I think you see a world of so much more uncertainty, no matter what we went through. And that's what I feel frustrated, guilty, but I feel really great to live when I did and to have gone through the 60s. That this was, it was so great no longer to worry about the establishment, and that you basically had to play along. All these trends, from drugs to sex to everything, was a tectonic change in the culture that we were part of. So I think the uniqueness of the period we lived in is what strikes me, and it's not replicable.
Just speaking of tectonic changes that happened with us, does anybody here, everybody here must remember the generation gap?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, did everybody feel the generation gap the way I did with my parents? Now, do you parents out there, do you feel the same way with your kids? I don't. I really feel that I can reach down and understand them in a way that my parents never could, even though, you know, we have differences about whether I read the newspaper or my daughter reads the internet instead. But basically, you know, I haven't seen the generation gap come back, and in fact, our daughter is still living with us.
That's
What gap? What gap? There's no gap, right? No gap.
is the gap.
I will say, though, that I do think ultimately I am optimistic about the future of the country, and the reason I'm optimistic is because of my kids and the young people that I meet today. Can we get through the next 15 years before all of us die out and the country is left to a better world? I don't know. But, I mean, if you look at political attitudes, it's amazing. I mean, look at the attitudes of younger voters today and across the board. At least I am very, very pleased and awed by them. And I do think it's a question, though, of whether we can get through this next 15 years without humongous damage. And I think that's an open question, but I do think that the future after the next 15 years is a much better one in terms of American politics.
Neil, does your daughter have a marijuana?
Actually, that's the other interesting thing. We raised our daughter around marijuana the way she was raised around alcohol. It was something that adults do, you know, and she can do it too when she gets old enough. But and I actually had a very hard time finally explaining to her why one of them was illegal and the other wasn't. We had to explain it when she got into school, of course. Actually, she got an award in high school, for a drug-free award, for not using either alcohol or any other drugs the whole time she was in high school, and she was awarded a giant chocolate chip cookie the size of a pizza on graduation. So, since then, she has dabbled once or twice in things, but no, I think it's a lot of the people of that generation sort of look on drugs as one of those hippie things their parents did. There you go. Hey.
Michael, I'm sorry, you may have explained this, and it just went past me, but are you choosing 15 years? Are you choosing 15 years specifically as a time period which will see the people in this room in our generation disappear?
Well, we might hang on
Thank you.
longer than 15 years, but, and I don't know whether it's going to be 15 or 18, but right now, if you look at the attitudes of younger voters, and then you look at, again, I'm a very partisan kind of a guy, I'll be first to admit it, but if you look at the retrograde pockets that control the Republican districts, their vote is 55 and up. Not to say they don't have some younger votes, but it's 55 and up. It's also predominantly, not completely, but it's white men. And they understand something that is profound, and they may not understand exactly what to do about it, but they understand that the days when white men ran America by themselves are numbered, and they're right.
So essentially, you're talking about the when we reach the point where minorities become the majority.
No, it's also, it's younger across race and across gender. So if you look at attitudes, for instance, attitudes towards gay rights, if you look, and the break, the profound break is generational, not other demographics. It's not wealth, it's not education, it's not even religion. It is age. People who are under 30 don't understand why it is anyone's issue who someone else sleeps with and could care less, right? Generation gap of that kind, yes, of that kind. And so, you know, but again, it's not a complete picture, because if you also look on economic issues, one of the problems is that there is not an alternative economic narrative and theory about how the common good could come first in a way that wasn't bureaucratic, that wasn't totally individualistic, and that recognized the validity of market forces without completely deifying them. So, you know, I think there's a lot of work, and I'm not, when I say I'm optimistic, I'm not optimistic there's going to be just across the board change, but there's going to be a much better chance once that cohort of voters becomes the dominant.
Young people learned their tolerance and liberalism from us.
Thank goodness. However, it's also interesting because if you look at young evangelicals, they share that tolerance and they didn't learn it from their parents. So there's something about the culture, and I do think it is legitimately something that we can lay some claim to a heritage of tolerance.
I didn't mean so much from us as their immediate parents, but from us as people who lived and made the 60s. I may be, I don't mean to be Pollyanna, and I certainly huff and puff. I stomp around the room in front of the TV and blow off steam about the culture war. There's a lot to be very unhappy about. But you know, we have a mixed-race president in his second term. McNeil there is now Eiffel Woodward and Woodruff and whom? Sorry? Yeah. I may have the wrong lady. I'm sorry, but two married couples invited my wife and me to share a beach house with them this summer, and we had a great time. And my wife and I were the only co-ed couple. And so we live in a different time that makes me very happy to reflect on in that regard, despite the long road that leads to, remains to be traveled ahead of us.
What a quiet group, so unlike you. Speak for yourself, friend.
I was trying to think what the great issues are children and grandchildren face that are comparable to the ones we faced. And I studied China, and I think the great issue in foreign policy that they face is our relationship with China. And we have vilified all these Asian takeoffs. For Jimmy Carter, Taiwan and South Korea were evil personified. There was a book about the coming war with Japan. You don't, there have been serious objectionable things that each of these places has done domestically and in foreign policy, and that's certainly true of China. But collectively, these have probably been the greatest improvement in the lives of human beings that has happened in all of world history. And through a combination of the national security state and kind of gut reactions to somebody else succeeding, we have come as a nation to adopt, I'd say, the mildest thing I can say is a much more hostile posture than is necessary. How many times do you read in the New York Times or in a presidential speech that life expectancy has gone from 41 to 73 in China in our lifetime, and considerably, about half of our lifetime. And the lobbying for a more militarized response, the training of a generation of officers. Interesting, if you talk to military officers about China, the guys on top are remarkably informed, sensible, balanced. You go 2 levels down and keep going from there down. We trained a generation of officers to think of China as the enemy. Probably the American-Chinese relationship is probably contributing more to the economic improvement of the human race than anything that's ever happened in history. We don't focus on that, and I think we're in a vicious circle that is going to cause great trouble for our children and grandchildren. There are people on both sides of the Pacific that are pretty sensible about this. In fact, our presidents have been pretty sensible on both sides. But there's a momentum below the president, below the commander-in-chief Pacific, and it's particularly prominent in the media, that is heading us toward a confrontation that could turn one of the best things in world history into the worst. I think that's going to be, along with global warming and the environment, the great challenge that our children and grandchildren are going to have to face, and maybe we can help them think it through in a balanced way.
You mentioned the environment and you mentioned China. Have we thought about the whole issue of resource scarcity? There are now 3 times as many people on this planet as there were when we were born, and they are using resources. We are using resources at a much greater rate than ever before. And while we've gotten a second wind here with this shale gas, the fact is you cannot extrapolate American or Western European standard of living to the rest of the world. The resources are just not there to do it. We have to change our whole technological world system to be able to accommodate so many people, and I am fearful of a crash somewhere down the road, though maybe not in our lifetimes.
I too fearful of a crash, but I don't think it's going to be because we run out of resources. People have been. One of the things early in my career was I found myself debating with the Club of Rome. And, they said that the world was going to run out of resources, and we were all going to die from pollution in 135 years. And we took their models back 135 years, prior to 1974. And it turned out we were all going to die before 1974 because the need for transportation had increased so much that we were all going to be at least 8 feet deep in horse manure. And it neglected the greatest pollution-saving device in history, which is the automobile. We're not going to run out of resources. We may melt the Arctic and the Antarctic and destroy our world. I think these two things are very, very different. We also, it's another area in which we look at the Chinese. And they've got a horrible, horrible environment problem. When I started going to Japan in 1963, Tokyo was like Beijing today. In Life magazine, if you go back, you'll see the pictures of all the twisted little kids with Minamata disease from all the mercury in the soil. And now you go to Tokyo and it's much cleaner than New York. Who is the world leader in solar? China. Who is the world leader in wind? China. Who's going to turn to electric cars faster than anybody else? China. They're going to turn it around. India's the problem. It's the ones that don't develop, the ones that don't improve their living standards. I had the same, until about 2 months ago, I had the same image we all do from reading the New York Times. Air pollution in China is the worst in the world. I went online and there's the Yale Global Ranking of effective air pollution on human health from 0 to 100, which is the US, the best in the world. And tied for best in the world. And China came in at 47.3, and India came in at 3.7. 47.3, 3.7. The countries that succeed generate the resources and the technology to clean the stuff up. The countries that fail are going to drag us down. That's the horrible future. We've got to somehow reverse the situation in India.
Other, way back? Oh, sorry. Sorry.
I certainly bow to Bill's knowledge of global economics, and my concern is more social and ethical. When we grew up in the 60s, we were a center-left, left progressive society. Now, all the media would have us believe that we are center-right and growing further right. Do you guys agree with that? And if so, how did we let that happen? Because it was us.
Let me talk about the media for a minute. I mean, that was really what I was going to start to talk about in the first place, and I decided that I was tired of it, and maybe you were too. I thought we wanted to have a little more fun here. But yeah, I mean, what happened was the voices that gave us a common hearth and gave us fact-based stuff once in a while, not all the time, that is harder to get. And I think the politics of media now are the more dramatic it is, the easier it is to build your base and get your money. And that's true in media, that's true in politics. It's the same thing. You have to be popular now to get anywhere. And in journalism, I was proud to be unpopular. I could ask really terrible questions of Dan Quayle, and a lot of people would be mad, but that was my job. So I do think that you've posed the huge question for us as we have, 10 minutes left to go, which is why are our politics such a mess? And before everyone else in the room with great wisdom answers that, I'd just like to give you a perspective from Central Europe, former communist Central Europe, which is renationalizing things, and where the youth are as likely to be in Jobbik, the far-right anti-Semitic party, anti-Roma party, as they are to be progressives. And while many of them believe in gay rights, others don't. And I also, that's still, I think, our #1 trading partner, Europe. Am I right about that, folks? Europe is having real problems right now. But culturally and socially, to get to your point, media are not the game there. It's all, because media are now a self-perpetuated thing. Young people are doing their own media. Old people aren't, generally. But I have to say, I think agency, the sense of standing up, is something about Americans, and especially about us, our generation. And I think about our kids. I know it's about my kids. That is not normal in the world. Standing up. Now, some people couldn't stand up during World War II or during communism. They'd get killed. They didn't stand up, or they stood up and got killed. But we can, and our kids can. And a lot of people don't get it that they can. And that, to me, from living abroad, is one of the most spectacular things about this country. I don't want us to leave today feeling down about this. It is spectacular. And the Chinese people I encounter and know about don't think they can. And if they can, they're going to cause a lot of trouble to your beautiful economic model. My friends in the State Department think it's all going to blow up at some point. So good for you for your economic optimism there. But all I can say is I think we should be enormously proud and happy that we, some of us, you, tried to stand up. That's what our kids, I think, are often trying to do. And that is not a normal human thing out there in the social and cultural world. So be grateful that that was something that we had and we did, and that others are still doing.
I mean, you raise a huge question that can't, we could talk about it for hours, and I will.
Is it still going to be 15 years before the country swings left again?
Well, yes and no. Let's remember a couple of things, which is we just had an election, and Obama, whatever you think of him, he is certainly a centralist. He's not a centrist. He's not a right-winger. Won, and he campaigned on his program of health care and other things. And yes, we have a Republican-dominated House who like to talk about, well, they got reelected. The statistics are that Democratic congressional candidates got 2 million more votes than were cast for Republican congressional candidates. But the system is, in terms of the jury rigging that took place, favors Republican incumbency. But the larger question is what has happened over the last 40 years, and you see country by country, not just in the US, you see a pattern in which basically corporate elites, I don't want to generalize too much, but launched a massive counter-offensive against what had been happening in the 60s and the late 50s with the civil rights movement, with the expansion of the welfare state, with more and more liberal reforms across democratic industrial societies. There has been a 40-year offensive to roll those back. And in this country in particular, there has been a strategy that we are now seeing come to its breaking point. Deals were made, I'm talking not conspiracy, I'm talking about very specific vote counting deals in which the conservative economic right wing of the Republican Party cut political deals with Southern whites and evangelical Christians to win national elections. That coalition, which has dominated much of the political life of the country since 1980, is now flying apart. We just saw that. What will happen, I have no crystal ball, I cannot tell you, but it is not indicative of a center-right country. It's indicative of a country whose politics are in crisis, whose politics are warped profoundly by money, and now we are seeing the basic norm of the last 30 or 40 years beginning to fly apart. What comes next, I don't know. But I feel sure that it is not a further movement to the right. It may just be more confusion and chaos in the middle, but I don't think it's more movement to the right. But again, I and I don't want to let myself and those of us who are active in the 60s off the hooks. I do think that our inability to transition from an anti-war movement into a viable political force and the absolutely centrifugal craziness of the late 60s and early 70s made it much easier for that counteroffensive. And for that, we have to take our own responsibility. And our own absence so much of the time over the last 40 years.
So as I'm listening to this, and it's really been a great bunch of presentations, there's lots of things to think about. I really like your comment, Michael, about we don't seem to have an economic model that pushes us beyond the way we are thinking now about what works economically and what's practical and what our experience has taught us. But as I'm listening to this and I'm thinking about, we're all focused in some sense on our legacy, locally and intimately in our families, and our legacy more broadly in our communities. The arc of the narrative now in America, as you sort of pick it up in the zeitgeist, I think, is of darkening hopes, of a tide of optimism receding that's accompanying, economic decline, yada yada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is in my mind for all of us, to which I have no answer, but I think it's one of those great questions you just keep asking, and the more you ask it, the better it gets, and the more fruit it yields. Is what's our locus of hope? Because ultimately, when the young look to the old, what they see is, one of two things: an incredible brightness, and Yeats's lapis lazuli says it's something that their ancient glittering eyes are gay. Why? Because if we're not asking that question, and if we're not striking that vein wherever it is, none of this other stuff will help very much.
Amen. Amen.
One last, is this thing working?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to return just momentarily to the question of agency. It strikes me, it has struck me for many years looking back, that one of the things that distinguished activism in our generation, there were two things in my mind. One, that we did have a faith that grassroots popular mobilization could bring change, and we had a faith based on fact. It happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
It happened. We also had a sense, a sort of Quaker sense, that no matter whether our action was effective or not, we had to do certain things because we were committed to the principle.
Yes.
And I don't believe that those things are anchored to the same extent in the current generation. That's my observation, and I'd be really happy to have other people say the opposite.
It does seem to me that there is a real locus for change currently on the internet. Provides all sorts of opportunities for social change at the grassroots level that's being used by lots of organizations, including our own. So I'm not so pessimistic on that. But as to the commitment, I don't know what this society is committed to at the moment, and I don't think it does either.
Well, let me just add a little bit. I mean, I think there's a lot at work. I mean, one is generations learn from the previous generations. And, one of the questions is, what is the story that our generation, what's the narrative that our generation has passed on to its children and their children? And has it been one that equally weights our experience as you just described it, because we saw change. We helped make change. I think, this question comes of where is hope? Where do you draw hope from? And for me, it's a combination of things. I mean, one, it's my children. I am blessed with 3 great children. One is she's a nurse practitioner doing rural health care in Maine. One is an actual organizer, which is something I just chuckle about. She worked on Obama's last field campaign and has just set up a new firm in Washington with the other field people doing political consulting and helping nonprofits. And my third is a 21-year-old boy who absolutely insists that politics is absolutely irrelevant to him, but loves Jon Stewart and has got me watching him. So one is just, from our kids and their friends. The other is there are surprising things to be aware of that, if you read the New York Times, you don't see it. And if you watch most of the media, but I'm telling you, the young immigrant population in this country is on fire. And they are doing things that take courage, that are strategic, and that are making a difference. When I say take courage, there are undocumented, illegal aliens, right? The undocumented immigrants who are going out of the country and then coming back to test Obama's commitment that they will not be deported, with no guarantee that they will be back and allowed back. And, there is, now I don't want to be overly optimistic. At the same time, there's this absolutely recalcitrant determination not to do anything about immigration reform in certain circles in the country. But, there is, and I'll tell you, there's one thing, and then I'll shut up. There's one thing that started me and stays with me. I cringe when I hear all the USA first, American exceptionalism, and so on. But every time I go back and I read the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I start to tear up. We have a great democratic tradition in this country that needs to be nurtured, praised, and celebrated, and is the source of so many movements that we are the inheritors of and that we were part of in the 60s. Now I'll shut up.
That's it. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Go out and celebrate. Celebrate what there is, because there's plenty of it around, and it's catching.